and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is a Tuesday edition of Point of View, and so grateful that you can join us. As you might imagine, especially this week and even today, we will be talking about a variety of different topics. Just a few minutes, we're going to be talking with our good friend Kerby Bauer, in part because he is an individual that is going to encourage you, as he oftentimes does, to support Point of View, but this time not necessarily financially support Point of View, but to support Point of View by subscribing to the Viewpoints commentary that we put out each day. And, of course, we'll also talk about his end-of-day report. We'll also have some other articles that relate to that. The bottom of the hour, after we've said goodbye to him, we're going to spend some time also then talking about, okay, what is the plan from the Trump administration, and in particular from the individual who is the Secretary of Treasury, Scott Bessent, in terms of the economy. We have been talking about that. A little bit later, we'll get into the fact that there has been a great amount of criticism, I think unjustified, of this report from the Department of Health and Human Services about transgenderism, and in some respects illustrates again that there is just an unwillingness on the part of those who are promoting the LGBTQ agenda to even acknowledge that some individuals who identify themselves as transgender were not born that way, which is one of their arguments, and in some respects is due to social contagion. So we're going to get into that. As a matter of fact, we will also talk about it on Friday. I already have received an article from Dr. Merrill Matthews he thought we might want to discuss with him and Penna Dexter on Friday, so it won't be the first time we get into that. And just to maybe put a smile on your face, a lot of people said, are we really going to actually rebuild Alcatraz? I don't know that we are, but I'll give you a little facts on that as well, just because it, I think, sometimes is the tendency for this president to hold up a shiny object and the media start talking about it, takes away from some of the other things that are taking place. So anyway, we'll get into those issues next hour. I think you will appreciate the fact we'll also have a conversation with Christopher Reese. He is an individual that is the editor of the Worldview Bulletin, and we'll talk about what does it mean to be happy. And for those of you that miss Dennis Prager, because he has been out from a major accident that took place, he used to do a happiness hour, so we'll get into something that I think would be of benefit to you. And a couple of other things. There's a report right now about the FBI really botched an investigation, and a couple other things that we will try to get to today if we can. But let's, if we can, start with the first article that I have, and it's by Tom Knighton, and it's really tied into the conversation I plan to have with Kerby Bauer, because Kerby Bauer, his end-of-day report on Monday talked about the culture war, and again, in a sense, sort of the war against children. Well, Thomas Knighton calls it war against children, and okay, we start with a disclaimer that sometimes a columnist, a pundit, news commentator engage in a little hyperbole. But as we get into this, you'll realize I think that's probably appropriate. Thomas Knighton says, I live in southwest Georgia, but my head has spent the last week in Buffalo, New York. The allegations leveled against the public school system there by a detective on a popular podcast just keep getting worse. And he goes on to say, for me, as a parent and a survivor of childhood sexual assault, this hits close to home. Now, you might say, well, I haven't heard much about that. He then goes on to talk about others. So I want our listeners in Western New York, I'm not just going to beat up on Buffalo, because then he talks about what's happening in California, where there seems to be the attempt to try to not only normalize individuals who are engaged in what we would call pedophilia, but now is called minor attracted persons. And that has been a big issue there as well. And we'll get into some more details of that with Kerby Bauer. But if you're not familiar, Buffalo, New York has been kind of a big issue because the detective there, Richard High, unveiled all sorts of allegations against the Buffalo Public Schools, and the media, of course, went on the attack. Not on the school, but on the individual that brought those, which we've seen before. And so you also can begin to recognize that sometimes when there is a criticism of the public schools, immediately some of the teachers groups and others close ranks, get the media to attack the messenger, and yet there are at least a few people that have published a few of the stories. One of those comes from WIVB, in which it talks about a Buffalo elementary school principal is off the job accused of abusing a child who attends school. Notice of the claim, which indicates the family's intention to sue, names the defendants, and we'll go into all of that, but it includes the individuals there at the school. The alleged abuse is said to have happened over the course of 6 months. The accusations were made as a notice of a claim filed by the alleged victim's father and their attorney. A family of the student claims that he was sexually abusing the child, bullying the child on a number of occasions, and it goes through some of that, which, quite frankly, I'm not going to read on the air, but you can let your mind wander and imagine how bad it is. Let's take another one, this one from just a while back. The Albany Times-Union, let's give them credit as well. Some people actually do want to do journalism. In this case, talking about the Buffalo schools have had an issue with corporal punishment. Well, again, some of us grew up where there was corporal punishment. Some of us had teachers that had paddles, but this, again, goes far beyond even what was allowable back in the schools when I went to school. And in this case, they're talking about 100 different instances where there is reasonable suspicion of corporal punishment or child abuse that went far beyond that. Incidents, I won't go into all the details, they're pretty gory, include a teacher pressing a knee on the neck of a student on the ground, a teacher making sexually charged comments to students, or watching pornography in their presence, an aide spanking a child, a school security officer punching a child in the head. And again, you can let your mind wander and imagine how bad it is. Okay, I recognize Tom Knighton because he has suffered sexual abuse in his past, could certainly be very upset about this and would refer to this as a war on children. But I do believe that that is, I think, a setup for some of the conversation we're going to have with Gary Bauer, because his Monday end-of-day report reminds us again that, and he was now going to move to Burlington, Massachusetts, so I don't want anybody to think I'm just picking on Buffalo, New York, or Massachusetts, or in a few minutes we'll talk about Montgomery County, Maryland, because of that Supreme Court case. But there is a lot of evidence that we need to do what we can to defend our children and our grandchildren. Again, I'm not criticizing everybody in the field of education. There are a lot of outstanding administrators, a lot of outstanding principals, a lot of outstanding teachers. But the reality is some things have begun to wind down in a way that doesn't look good, and we are beginning to lose some perspective. And it's understandable sometimes when the students no longer respect the adults and the teachers and the administrators. It's not surprising sometimes that there is a reaction that brings out the worst in some of those individuals. But that's kind of the theme for at least the first half hour. The article that, if you want to read in its entirety, War on Children by Thomas Knighton, is posted. And when we come back, we're going to talk with our friend Gary Bauer on what he calls the culture war and the impact it's having on our children. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The conflict between Harvard University and the Trump administration has been in the news. Victor Davis Hanson uses the news story to ask an important question. Do elite universities really wish to fight the federal government? In his commentary, he unveils a half a dozen problems at universities that might cause American taxpayers to reconsider how much money should be given to them. The first problem is well known. He says over the past half century, tuition has generally risen at twice the rate of inflation. A major reason for this is the fact that the student loan program is run by the federal government. Colleges counted on an insured stream of tuition money and so raised their prices inordinately given federal guarantees. Unfortunately, the percentage of students who have defaulted on their loans, along with those currently late on their payments, is increasing. That is why he suggests that universities with multi-billion-dollar endowments should guarantee their own student loans. They would have a financial interest in seeing their own students graduate in 4 years, get jobs, and pay back their alma mater promptly and fully. A second problem is the lack of any intellectual diversity on campus. Some recent studies have found that liberal professors outnumber their conservative counterparts by a 10-to-1 margin, especially in the social sciences and humanities. They are conservatives and Christians with PhDs in the market, but they are excluded because of political bias. College students rarely get to hear the other side of an argument because professors with those views are essentially banned from campus. These are just two of the concerns documented by Victor Davis Hanson. Tomorrow I will discuss a few of the others he mentions. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of intelligent design, go to viewpoints.info/intelligent design. Viewpoints.info/intelligent design. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
As I mentioned just a few minutes ago, we are privileged to have with us Gary Bauer for a couple of reasons. Number one, we've been encouraging you to subscribe to the Viewpoints commentary that comes out, but also you've heard me every time we've ever had him on to also encourage you to subscribe to the End of Day Report. We have posted that one today, and the first article there is on the culture war. And Gary Bauer, if you're not familiar, is, of course, the president of American Values, served as chief domestic policy advisor under Ronald Reagan. And Gary, it's always great to have you on the program.
Hey, Kerby, it's always great to be with you. There's a lot going on, and as you just alluded to, the war for America continues. It's just relentless. It happens in every little burg, city, and even neighborhood in America. We're blessed to have leadership right now in Washington that's on our side, but that won't always be the case. So I know that you're going to remain on the front lines just as I am, because we got to win this war.
In a few minutes, I do want to talk about the National Day of Prayer and the Religious Liberty Commission and things like that. But I started by actually sharing a piece from Tom Knighton about war on children, and he talks about what's happening in Buffalo and in California. Your piece talks about what's happening in Massachusetts, and I was thinking, you and Dr. Dobson ought to do a book. Maybe you could call it Children at Risk. Oh, wait a minute, you did. And that was in 1992, so a third of a century ago. You were warning individuals that we have to pay attention to some of the things happening to our children. Of course, you also had served as the Undersecretary of Education, and we're well aware of that. But it does seem to me that in some respects, we're dealing with the issues in even greater intensity than back in 1992.
There's no question about it, Kerby. And by the way, you just succeeded in making me feel really old. I had a recent birthday, and we're not going to mention which one it was. But yes, when Dr. Dobson and I wrote that book, it was greeted in many circles as being alarmist.
Yes.
Off the rails, et cetera, including by some of our Christian brothers and sisters. Every once in a while, I take it off the shelf and but dust off the dust and read it, and it sounds actually quaint. I almost would work for an America like the one we were describing them. It's just been really a speeding train that we've been on. But the key point here, Kerby, is what you emphasize so in such an articulate way in everything that you do. This is really a battle for our children. It's the minds of our children that the globalist, secularist left desperately wants. And it's what, since those children were given to us by God, by our Creator, we are obligated to protect and defend what God has given us.
I might just mention the first article there is his end-of-day report, and of course it's talking about what's happening right now in Massachusetts with middle school students. But I was just thinking while we're looking at that, how much has changed. I don't remember in Children at Risk, you were talking about the risk from, fentanyl, because it didn't exist right back then, or we didn't know about it. We weren't talking about the risk of going to a particular drag queen reading program. You weren't talking about the risk of boys playing in girls' sports. Matter of fact, if you'd put that in there, they really would have wanted to institutionalize both of you. And yet that's what we find ourselves talking about here now.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? I mean, you're right. They would have put us in a straitjacket, and there'd probably be a free Dobson Bauer movement or something. But no, we're in Never Never Land. I mean, it would be if somebody made up a comedy skit 15 years ago about the things that supposedly well-educated, serious people are claiming today, that the comedy skit wouldn't get any laughs. People would go, "What are you talking about?" But this is what happens when you get unmoored. I was reminded the other day, if we just followed the first chapter of Genesis, where we're told we're made in the image of God, if one actually believes that, if a culture believes that, if a nation believes that, transgenderism, abortion on demand, same-sex marriage, all that stuff would be immediately rejected because it's not consistent with being made in the image of God.
One of the issues that you do talk about here is these middle schools in Massachusetts, as young as age 11, are supposed to identify themselves as male, female, mix of both, neither. Then they describe intercourse. Again, this is radio. We won't even go into that in a way that would be more inclusive of LGBTQ. And I tie that into a Supreme Court case because you live, I believe, in Virginia, but up there I know you know Montgomery County, Maryland. Yeah. And here we're talking about 3-year-olds that they're reading to them the Pride puppy. A puppy goes to the Pride parade, or they have a story about a young girl whose uncle is gay and wants to get married, and she's got some questions about that, or a girl that thinks she's a boy. And I don't know about you, but when you're growing up in Kentucky, of course, I was growing up in Berkeley, so I did see a lot of this. The bottom line is we didn't hear about things that would be associated with sex education until maybe high school. And now we're talking about 3-year-olds. And back to your favorite line, you just cannot make this stuff up.
Yeah. No, and it's really, I think, telling that they keep going down the age range. They want children when they are the most susceptible to listening to an adult. And of course, many children at a young age will look up to their teacher as being a much nicer parent. The teacher pats them on the head and isn't too unpleasant and doesn't get harsh with them, doesn't make them go to bed early. And so there's this effort by these ideological teachers to wean these children away. We used to just worry about spending a lifetime saving your money to send your kid to a college where a professor would do it. Now you got to worry about it in elementary school and junior high. This is serious stuff. It's stuff that in a previous era in America, parents would have literally physically fought to keep their children from being subjected to any of this.
Let me just mention that, again, we always encourage people to get the end-of-day report, but one of the reasons you were willing to come on is also to talk about the value of my daily Viewpoints commentary. It comes to you free of charge Monday through Friday. Penedextra does a weekly one, so that comes on Saturday. And, Gary, you are well aware of the fact that when we address these issues, sometimes people don't have a chance to listen to a 2-hour program. Of course, a lot of people that hear my 2-minute commentary on American Family Radio or on Bot Radio Network, on the Moody Network, maybe don't even carry Point of View. And so it is important to get that information out. And just as we've encouraged people to get your end-of-day report, I know you wanted to encourage our listeners to sign up for our Viewpoints commentary.
Well, absolutely, Kerby. You know, the Bible is full of exhortations about seeking the truth. Getting the truth these days is, I mean, it's like going on an exploration into a deep jungle trying to look for it. Often what's being presented as the truth are actually well-crafted lies to confuse us, to take our attention someplace else. The thing I love about Viewpoint is that I know it's going to be 2 minutes of the truth, and you can't put a price on that. It's an asset that I wish every American was listening to all 5 days of the week that you do these. If they were listening to them, then we'd be in a much better position than we are in now. So God bless you, Kerby. Keep it up. This is an important tool in this battle to save our children and to ultimately save our country.
Just before I go, you were, of course, at the National Day of Prayer, and that was encouraging. And I saw your picture there, but also putting together a National Religious Liberty Commission. It seems to me sometimes when people are discouraged, I keep saying, yeah, but look up. Help is on the way, isn't it?
It is. President Trump is really committed to this issue of religious liberty. I know, there are critics, even within the body of Christ. I understand that. He's not everybody's cup of tea. But I tell you, when it comes to these policies, there's not been anybody like him in a long, long time. I worked for Reagan for 8 years. But Donald Trump has a way of taking this battle right into the teeth of our opposition. This new commission is really important. I'll tell you something else, Kerby. We have our 250th anniversary next year of our country. The president's planning big things next year, and one of those things is going to be related to rededicating our nation to the Lord.
Wow.
So I think we're going to see some things in the months ahead that are going to astonish people.
Gary Bauer, always great to have you on the program. Look forward to the next opportunity. And again, if you would like to know more about him, we have a link to the website and, of course, to the end-of-day report. Of course, we have a banner there right now, so you can subscribe to the Viewpoints commentary. Let's take a break. We have a lot to cover right after this.
Let's be honest. Getting a well-rounded and biblical understanding of current events takes time that many of us simply don't have. Well, here's the good news. You can get thoroughly researched biblical insight on a variety of topics in 2 minutes or less each day by subscribing to Kerby Anderson's Viewpoints commentary. These short, free emails offer Kerby's personal perspective on issues affecting us in America, and they are filled with educational resources. Listen to this testimonial from David, a longtime Viewpoint subscriber.
I've been reading Kerby's daily commentaries every weekday for years now. Never miss one because they're always incredibly well written and researched, to the point, and really are meaningful. I would recommend the commentaries to anybody.
Subscribe to Viewpoints for free by going to pointofview.net/signup. That's pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, want to get into some of the issues in the news. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, or just sit back and take some notes and maybe find some of these articles, because from time to time, I really do try to dig out what I think would be the most important issues for you to know about. And as we were just talking about a minute ago, the Viewpoints commentary comes out each day. And if you aren't already subscribed, I thought it would be good this week to just take some time to promote that. Those of you that receive an email probably received an email from Liberty in which she made a case for why it would be helpful for you to subscribe to the Viewpoints commentary, and even gave an example of that. And some of you might say, well, I didn't even know you had a Viewpoints commentary. And I recognize that sometimes the radio stations that carry Point of View don't carry the commentary because they say, well, we already heard from you. I understand that. Although I found a lot of people appreciate the commentary because they say, I'll be honest, I don't have the opportunity to listen to you 2 hours a day. Although it's amazing how many people I've met over these last couple of months who say, I listen to you every day, the entire show. I thought, that's great. But some people say, I would love to get sort of a synopsis, a Cliff's Notes version. And as Gary Bauer and I just talked about, it only takes 2 minutes for me to record it, which means it probably only takes you about a minute or more to read it. And one of the values of getting it in your inbox is now you have it. And it has usually facts and figures. Sometimes I have a reference to an article that I'm citing, sometimes more than one, because if somebody said, well, okay, you gave us some statistics, but I want to read it for myself. You know my philosophy. Don't have to trust me. Go read it for yourself. That's why we have posted, 6 different articles today for you to read. And so there's a lot that we can give to you, but also recognize you're busy. And you say, look, I just don't have 2 hours. I happen to be hearing you right now, and I'll have to then go into an office, or I got to do something else. I won't even get to hear what you're going to cover the next hour with Christopher Reese or something like that. And so, for example, my Viewpoints commentary today is kind of part 1 and 2 on elite universities, because I found the piece by Victor Davis Hanson to be so good. And sometimes we can have him on, but I find that oftentimes I can do just about as good a job, maybe even a better job sometimes, of articulating in a short amount of time the key arguments that they would make if we brought them on the program. So again, I hope that you'll think about the Viewpoints commentary, signing up for it. It is not only something that you get to hear, but as I was just mentioning, I think we're on almost all, if not all, of the American Family radio stations. I think we're on all of the Bot Radio Network stations, on many of the Moody Broadcasting, Moody radio stations, as well as, of course, many of the stations that carry Point of View. So its reach is even larger and more significant. Anything you can do to sign up, or perhaps even to pass that on so that other people would sign up, that would certainly be something we're talking about this week. Let me, though, get to the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent. And I think it's fair to say that sometimes people in the cabinet write with a lot of hyperbole and a lot of flowery language, and they really don't get to the facts. This is a different Treasury Secretary, as illustrated by the fact that he, once again, in a short number of pages, it only took me 4 pages to print this out from the Wall Street Journal, and really I'm going to just summarize the 3 key points that he has about what is Donald Trump trying to do. There's some that are saying they don't know what they're doing. The president comes up with a different idea every day, and we'll talk about Alcatraz and the parades and some of that in just a little bit. But let's get to this. And he says, first of all, readers of this paper, meaning the Wall Street Journal, know better than anyone that Wall Street has experienced historic success over the last 4 decades. Since 1980, the S&P 500 has increased more than 5,000%. Her capital markers are the envy of the world, and President Trump intends to strengthen them further. But here's the issue. The people that are benefiting the most are the people that own stock. The people that are benefiting the most are the people that have assets or have houses. The others aren't. And so the point is, in his 3rd paragraph, Scott Bessent points out, Donald Trump wants to ensure working families aren't left behind in this new era of economic growth, as many were in the last. And in the first 100 days of his presidency, we have laid the groundwork to actually rebalance global trade, restore America's industrial base, and build an economy that allows Wall Street and Main Street to rise together. To understand the urgency of this economic rebalancing, it's critical to understand why it is necessary in the first place. And then he takes us through some of the things we've talked about before, whether it's the allowing China to join the World Trade Organization and some of the things we've talked about on this program so often, and even on our most recent Outlook magazine about how China has been able to manipulate markets and use our freedom against us, and how in some respects, whether we're talking about the industrial base or the manufacture of pharmaceuticals or a number of others, those have all just moved over. Even the minerals and some of the others that you'll be reading about in some of my commentaries are the case. And so then the bottom line is this. Donald Trump intends to usher in the most prosperous decade in American history, but not at the cost of the spiritual degradation of the working class. So, if you're taking some notes, number 1 to 3. Number 1, renegotiating global trade. That's what the tariffs are all about. He says tariffs are an effective tool for balancing international commerce. They reduce trade barriers in other countries, opening more markets to American producers, while also bringing back thousands of manufacturing jobs. The newly elected Prime Minister of Canada was with Donald Trump, and I think Donald Trump made it pretty clear we're not removing tariffs anytime soon. And I've given you numerous examples about that, but my favorite one has to do with cheese. For our listeners in Wisconsin, you know as well as I do, you can't sell your cheese across the border in Canada because last time I looked, I think it was a 300% tariff. They want to protect the cheese manufacturers in Canada, but it means that you will never sell your cheese in Canada, even though the Canadian border is closer to you than almost 20 or 30 of the states of the United States, but you're just simply limited because of the tariffs. So that's number 1. Number 2, making the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act permanent and adopting the president's new tax priorities: no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on Social Security. Again, if you want to make the case that the president has, in a sense, become the champion of the working class, that is the case. In the past, I think it was fair to say that the Democratic Party really talked about the working class, but that is something that has changed, I think, rather dramatically now. Most of the individuals that have donated sizable sums to the Democratic Party are billionaires, Wall Street people, and the rest. There are some, obviously, that have donated to the Republican Party, and those are the ones you almost always hear about in the news, but you never hear about the others. And in some respects, these have flipped rather dramatically. And the point that he's making, Secretary Bessent makes, is that workers and small businesses benefit the most from some of the things that Donald Trump put together in his pro-tax agenda in his first term, and we can see that statistically because the bottom 50% of households saw their net worth increase faster than the top 10%. You wouldn't hear that from Bernie Sanders. Not sure you'd hear that from Chuck Schumer, but you just heard it, if you will, from the Secretary of Treasury, and there are links to all of that in case you say, wait a minute, I want to look it up for myself. Go ahead. The numbers are there. You don't have to believe me or him. You can read it for yourself. But that brings us to number 3, and that is, of course, we talked about the tariffs, we talked about the tax cuts, and what was already implemented in 2017. But number 3, the deregulation of the economy. He says America must build again, not only homes and factories, but also semiconductors, power plants, artificial intelligence, data centers, other technologies of the future. I would add to that, of course, I've just done a commentary on that, also pharmaceuticals. We just cannot allow China to be the source of 95% of our generic drugs. We need, as we learn from the pandemic, to change that as well. So anyway, he ends by saying, for America to build, government needs to get out of the way. That's why this administration embraces an ambitious deregulation agenda. That really was just the first 3 pages. Again, you can read the rest because he gives you some other facts and figures and other information about what's going to happen in the 4th page. But it's an illustration, again, that if you sort of said, I'm not quite sure what the president is doing, or you know somebody that says, I think the president is ruining the economy, could you pass this particular article on? Say, just read it, and if at the end you still believe that, well, I can't convince you otherwise, but I think there's some pretty good solid facts to say this is the way to really re-energize the working class of America and to make sure that a middle class still exists in the 21st century. Let's take a break. We'll continue more right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, the 4th article that we've posted for you today is just to give you the other side of an ongoing conflict that you're going to hear about, and we like to cover those kinds of things on Point of View. And it is written by Abigail Anthony. Medical associations and LGBTQ plus organizations condemn the transphobic HHS report. Now, what we're talking about is the Department of Health and Human Services put together a report looking at the issue of what's called gender-affirming care for minors. And as you can tell from the title, there has been a criticism of that as well. It is entitled, first of all, let's go back to how that happened. And that is President Trump signed an executive order entitled Protecting Children from Chemical and Surgical Mutilation. Okay, you know where he stands on the issue. Got it. And then announced that the Secretary of Health and Human Services would publish a review of the existing literature on what they would say are the best practices for promoting the health of children who assert gender dysphoria or rapid onset gender dysphoria or other identity-based confusion. And they had a requirement that within 90 days to produce a report. What they did was evaluate 17 systemic and systematic reviews and concluded that there were a lot of flaws with those that have been trying to promote transgenderism and gender dysphoria and the rest. And as a result, and you've had, as you imagine, LGBTQ organizations criticize that. And again, one that is perhaps the most surprising, even some of the more politicized members of the American Academy of Pediatrics say they were alarmed by this as well. And so the argument has always been that if you really want to look at the data, then science should be actually accepted. And the HHS report says, yes, we believe the science, but we don't believe biased scientists. And some of these studies that were arguing for the need for various kind of gender-affirming actions are flawed at their core. Now you're going to get individuals, and you have had individuals saying that these are flawed as well. But let me, if I can, try to give the other side that you may not get in the mainstream media. The first is you find this by the time you get to the third page of this article, because it takes you to what is going on in England. We'll come back to this probably with Penna and Dr. Merrill Matthews for sure, because that's what is known as the Cass study. And the Cass study was actually commissioned by the United Kingdom National Health Service, the UK National Health Service. And as a result, they found that there was real concerns with the push towards this kind of what has oftentimes been referred to as gender mutilation. And as a matter of fact, the report, which came out last year, 2024, it has been evident that there has been a failure to reliably collect even the most basic data and information in a consistent and comprehensive manner. Data has not often been shared or has been made unavailable. And when you don't have a research study where they make the data available, that's when you start wondering if people are using their bias to push an agenda, and that is the case. A little bit later in this article, it talks about some of the research that has been done to sort of counter the HHS study, and some that came out in the past, in which the statement was made that transgender status is an immutable trait like eye color or height, and using language that suggests otherwise perpetuates falsehoods and stereotypes. So you can see that you're getting people that are getting really upset about this. And yet, if you go back to look at some of the evidence that we've made available to you, you can see that what the HHS report has concluded is actually validated by looking at even more studies. And I'm holding up right now my booklet that came out a while back on transgenderism. It's been out for a little less than 2 years. And just in the beginning, I spend some time quoting from this very significant study that was done by Dr. Paul McHugh. You might say, okay, who's he? Well, Dr. Paul McHugh, up until recently, served as the professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Johns Hopkins Medical School. For a time, he actually promoted the idea of transgender surgery until he finally concluded it wasn't working, and he concluded that gender reassignment surgery doesn't work. So Dr. Paul McHugh and Dr. Lawrence Meyer, and I give you the link to it, Sexuality and Gender, actually looked at 200 This other one was just 17. This one is 200 looking at peer-reviewed studies, many of these coming out before there was such a push to try to promote transgenderism, sometimes in the scientific community. And after looking at 200 peer-reviewed studies, they came to a couple of conclusions. In the interest of time, I'll go through them very quickly, but you can get the booklet from us and read it in its entirety. Number one, belief that sexual orientation is an innate, biologically fixed human property is not supported. In other words, people are not born that way. Number two, belief that gender identity is an innate, fixed human property independent of biological sex, again, is not supported by the data. The idea that a person may be a man trapped in a woman's body or a woman trapped in a man's body. Number three, again, I'm giving you direct quotes from most of this. Only a minority of children who express gender atypical thoughts or behavior will continue to do so into adolescence. We've talked about that before. And I think one of the best books on that is by Dr. Kerby Anderson, who I quoted yesterday, When Harry Became Sally, responding to the transgender moment. And number four, people who are homosexual or transgender have higher rates of mental problems, behavioral and social problems than the general population. Again, this comes from not looking at one study, not looking at the bias. Matter of fact, if anything, Dr. Paul McHugh changed his mind because at one point he was one who was actually promoting the idea of gender reassignment surgery. But Dr. Paul McHugh and Dr. Lawrence Meyer, looking at 200 peer review studies, came to those four conclusions. And if those came too fast for you and you'd like to see the original article, it's in our booklet, which is entitled A Biblical Point of View on Transgenderism. And then much of the rest talks about the fact that we do have very good evidence that oftentimes, especially young girls who are transgender and think that they should be boys, a lot of that comes from social contagion. And that's well documented in the book by Abigail Schreier, Irreversible Damage, the Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters, and also comes from individuals that aren't even any, by stretch of the imagination, Christian or conservative, who have discovered some of that as well. So whether you look at the UK, the National Health Service, whether you look at some of the studies by Dr. Paul McHugh and others, or whether you just even want to cite my booklet that goes and gives you the references, you will certainly see that over the next few weeks, as people refer to this report that was mandated by the executive order by Donald Trump as being transphobic, it seems to me that it's taking a very good and more objective look at what is happening with this issue of transgenderism. Again, one of those issues we're dealing with. We started the program today with talking about Tom McKnighton's piece and even the piece by Gary Bauer. One more illustration of why you need to get some of the material we make available, both through our Viewpoints commentary and through those booklets we make available to those of you who donate to the ministry. The Viewpoints commentary is free, so really I would encourage you during the break to take the time to click on that banner and subscribe. We'd love to send you it free of charge. Let's take a break, though. We have a lot more to cover in the next hour, right after this.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I really appreciate your program. I don't get to listen to it every day because I have to work, but it's really a blessing to me and to all of us.
Everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
I do appreciate Point of View and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
I just appreciate all you guys do. I mean, I learned so much, and it's amazing what you teach that I say to other people, and they look at me like, where did you hear that? So I appreciate you guys. So thank you for all you do.
I just turned your program on, and I want to just let you know how much I appreciate just getting the truth out.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, I thought we'd get into a couple of other issues, but this first one is really intended to maybe make you smile or roll your eyes or shake your head, whatever. But I thought it would be appropriate. The other day when we heard that President Trump wanted to reopen Alcatraz, I said, well, there's a good example of what I call the social media president, who recognizes that by posting something like that on social media or making that announcement, it will then maybe redirect the media to other particular issues rather than talking about Doge or talking about deportation. All of a sudden, everybody be talking about Alcatraz. So I thought I'll just ignore that. But I thought, actually, there's a good way to evaluate that, and that's our next article that I've posted for you by Haley Strack. Now, first of all, let's just acknowledge that this is a president, and even when he was candidate, I think back in 2015, President Trump, or at that time Donald Trump, no longer president, but wasn't president at the time, candidate Trump was looking at the idea that sometimes I can just get a lot of attention by saying something that's a little bit outrageous, something that's beyond the pale. He has used that over the years. If you read his book, The Art of the Deal, he oftentimes will make a really outrageous statement or claim and then backtrack. And we were talking about this the other day. And so when I hear some of these things about, of course, they're talking about having an army parade next year. And when they're doing that army parade, it seems to coincide with his birthday, whether that was chosen by him, whether it's accidental. I mean, everybody's on the talk shows talking about it right now. And, of course, whether we have a parade or not is up to some kind of discussion. But nevertheless, this issue of Alcatraz is the case. And so he says, I'm directing the Bureau of Prisons, along with the Department of Justice, FBI, and Homeland Security, to reopen a substantially enlarged and rebuilt Alcatraz. Okay, I got to have some fun at the expense of the president, because the British newspaper Independent noted that at the time Donald Trump was in Mar-a-Lago, which is, of course, near Miami, and they noticed that Miami's local PBS affiliate was broadcasting Escape from Alcatraz. If you are familiar with that movie, that's where Clint Eastwood plays one of the prisoners that escapes. Never heard from again. I suspect he may be drowned in San Francisco Bay, but nevertheless, it was aired at 9 p.m. Eastern, then again re-aired. And so some people said maybe that was a factor in the president's announcement. But I like one wag said, perhaps the most shocking aspect of all of this is that Donald Trump watches PBS. So again, I'm just having some fun. But the point I'm making is that it is unlikely, highly unlikely that is the case. First of all, do we need a supermax prison? No, we have one of those in Colorado. We have some older prisons out there. You've always heard about sending people to Leavenworth. It turns out that we have 122 federal prisons. The oldest one is the one in Leavenworth, Kansas. The youngest one is right in southwestern Kentucky. And, of course, you have right now for individuals that need to be in custody, federal inmates in custody, we're at about 92%. So it's not like we're busting at the seams. And, of course, one of the reasons Alcatraz was shut down more than 6 decades ago, by the way, was it was just too costly to run. It even at the time was 3 times more costly than other federal prisons. Let's recognize that if you ever had a tour of that, and you can get a tour of that place, there's no outside power lines, clean water. It's deteriorating because of time and saltwater damage and weather conditions and all that. It is undergoing right now a $50 million renovation, but to get that done, I mean, it's going to take out hazardous material, replacing some of the steel reinforcements and all the rest. But to think that they would actually want to refurbish this, you have to remind yourself, what state is Alcatraz in? California. And I think it's quite clear that California Democrats, you 2 Democratic senators from California, your governor from California is Democrat, probably would delay the process rather dramatically. And so if anything, we don't really need another supermax prison. We have one in Florence, Colorado called the Alcatraz of the Rockies. But nevertheless, you'll hear about it for a few days, and I thought I just couldn't resist by pointing out that it just may be one of those attempts by the president to distract. And misdirection isn't just something that Harry Houdini did. It's something oftentimes that Donald Trump does. But just before I take a break, also, this is another one, shake your head for a different reason. The FBI now has been able to release, and this is because we have a new FBI director, Kash Patel, in which they did an investigation of the investigation. You might remember back in 2017 where you had a baseball field. They were practicing, and these individuals who were Republicans were shot at by an individual who unloaded, what was it? I've got a list here of how many shots he took there. But nevertheless, he was an individual who was radical, left-wing, Bernie Sanders supporter, on and on and on. But nevertheless, the individual filing was not willing to acknowledge any of that. As a matter of fact, if you go to the original report, it says the FBI case file makes it clear this case was a premeditated assassination attempt on a Republican congressman by a radical left-wing political extremist who was seeking to affect the conduct of our government. But you didn't get any of that in the published report. And in some respects, they point out that this is an individual who was upset with Donald Trump's election, took a concealed carry firearms class, told friends and family they may not see him again, an individual that then began to actually case the Eugene Simmons Park baseball field for 2 months, and then shot more than 70 rounds. I found it there, and then even was hiding behind some of the various structures there so he would be able to be more successful. They also found that the Bureau, that is the FBI, the Bureau of Investigation, did not really investigate. They didn't interview many of the congressional lawmakers present at the ball field. One of those is former representative from Alabama, Mo Brooks, who was not interviewed at all, despite the fact that he was present at the shooting and was one of those included on the list of targeted individuals this individual wanted to kill. And, of course, you might remember Representative Mo Brooks received a medal from the Capitol Police for exhibiting bravery during the shooting, and yet the FBI never did an interview with him. Any of you that are convinced that the government conceals information and maybe buys into those conspiracy theories, I think you can see some evidence that in a few cases that is the case. And there has been a deliberate attempt to prevent any kind of investigation of the investigation. But finally now you have the House receiving 2,500 pages from the FBI because Kash Patel forced the issue. And it turns out that this shooting, which could have been disastrous, but fortunately everybody survived, was indeed something that was not adequately covered by the FBI. Well, if they didn't cover something that led to the shooting of congressional members of Congress, there might be some other things we need to investigate as well. So I just thought I'd let you see that story coming out today, and we'll probably talk about it again sometime in the future. Let's take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The conflict between Harvard University and the Trump administration has been in the news. Victor Davis Hanson uses the news story to ask an important question. Do elite universities really wish to fight the federal government? In his commentary, he unveils a half a dozen problems at universities that might cause American taxpayers to reconsider how much money should be given to them. The first problem is well known. He says over the past half century, tuition has generally risen at twice the rate of inflation. A major reason for this is the fact that the student loan program is run by the federal government. Colleges counted on an insured stream of tuition money and so raised their prices inordinately given federal guarantees. Unfortunately, the percentage of students who have defaulted on their loans, along with those currently late on their payments, is increasing. That is why he suggests that universities with multi-billion-dollar endowments should guarantee their own student loans. They would have a financial interest in seeing their own students graduate in 4 years, get jobs, and pay back their alma mater promptly and fully. A second problem is the lack of any intellectual diversity on campus. Some recent studies have found that liberal professors outnumber their conservative counterparts by a 10-to-1 margin, especially in the social sciences and humanities. There are conservatives and Christians with PhDs in the market, but they are excluded because of political bias. College students rarely get to hear the other side of an argument because professors with those views are essentially banned from campus. These are just two of the concerns documented by Victor Davis Hanson. Tomorrow I will discuss a few of the others he mentions. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of intelligent design, go to viewpoints.info/intelligent design. Viewpoints.info/intelligent design. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Okay, for the rest of the hour, I thought we'd talk about some things that maybe apply more to your spiritual life rather than to some of the politics. We'll get back to some of that tomorrow. By the way, I think you will enjoy some of the conversation we're going to have tomorrow. We'll talk about an outreach in Uganda and reaching out to young women. We're going to talk about Hillsdale College, and in some respects, that relates very much to the conversation that we have here right now with my Viewpoints commentary. My commentary today is called Elite Universities Part 1. Tomorrow will be Elite Universities Part 2. And there have been some interesting things. Larry Arnn, we've had him on before. He's the president of Hillsdale College, has said to the president there at Harvard, you could maybe learn some lessons from us. We know that you've been around at least 100, 200 years longer than we have, but we think maybe we've learned a few lessons here in Hillsdale, and one of those is maybe you shouldn't take money from the government anyway, along with a lot of other things. So we'll talk about Hillsdale tomorrow and the value of some of these different institutions, because as you're thinking about where you're going to send your children or grandchildren to college, there are better choices for them than just sending them to the state universities. And, of course, sometimes that's the best place to go if they're going to be in engineering or science. But if they really want to learn to think, they're going to probably learn that in some of these private institutions and in some of these Christian colleges. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. But one of the things I wanted to do today is mention that we just sent out my booklet on false spirituality. And as I've mentioned before, you can get the Viewpoints commentary for free, so there's no reason why you couldn't go to the website right now and click on that button that says subscribe to Viewpoints, and that is something that you would receive free of charge. However, as I've pointed out before, one of the things we like to send to our donors, those of you that are part of the Truth Team, are these booklets. But at the same time, I recognize some of you say, well, I can't join the Truth Team. I'm really tight on finances. I think from time to time we like to give you the information, so again, you can get it for free. And last week, Liberty McCarter did a great job, just an outstanding job, if I might say, on this issue of chemical abortion. She's written on that twice, and this most recent booklet is just chock full of information. And I might just say that if you run a pregnancy resource center, you just need to have some of those booklets because they are so well done, and they are well worth it, and they're educational, and it even gets into some of the political issues there as well. Well, if you receive the booklets, you've received it, because I know I received mine just the other day, and this one we titled False Spirituality, but really what it is I couldn't find a title that emphasized what I really was trying to get at, and that is, you've probably heard some people say, well, I'm spiritual, but not religious. And it turns out, as I really dug into this, that there are sociologists that actually have given it an acronym, SBNR, spiritual but not religious, SBNR. So you're spiritual, not religious. And it turns out that there are studies that go all the way back to Carl Jung, of all places, probably even Sigmund Freud and others, that looked at, first of all, those people who practiced a religion, Catholic, Protestant, Jews, and then those who did not, and they had some level of spirituality, but they were not religious. Now, what that means, I think, for the younger generation, since we have a real desire to reach this younger generation, is, well, I'm sort of interested in spiritual things, but I'm not going to go to your church. It's kind of the case. If you dig in a little further, and you can find this in my booklet, and we'll be glad to give it to you free of charge. If you're not a donor, we'd be glad to send you one. And just simply let us know. We'd need an address to mail it to you, obviously, so give that to us in the email that you can get, and you can find all that on our website at pointofview.net. But it turns out that almost a quarter, 22%, in the latest Pew Research study, actually found that Americans, when they did that survey, fit into the category of spiritual, not religious. So if you're involved in evangelism, you're going to hear this phrase probably a little bit more than you might imagine. Now, about 1 in 5, or 21%, fit into the category of neither spiritual or religious, and then a majority of Americans fall into the category of religious. So in some respects, it's a little fuzzy how to separate that out. And as we have always talked about before, and that goes back to another booklet that we've made available to you called A Biblical Point of View on the Next Generation. We, in that one, talk about those individuals that are oftentimes referred to as the nones, N-O-N-E-S, or the unaffiliated. And those are individuals that are not affiliated with a church. And oftentimes when they're asked for their religious preference, they'll say atheist, agnostic, or no preference. So in some respects, some of the nones identify as atheist or agnostic, but the others that are sort of nothing in particular could be in this category as well. And so it shows that, first of all, they're spiritual but not religious. But when they were asked then if they were looking for a religion that would be right for you, the vast majority, 88%, said, no, not looking. Only a small 10% were. Now, here's the issue. You'll see all sorts of books talking about, I want to make this church a seeker-sensitive church. Now, last Thursday, you might have heard, we did the broadcast from KYCC. I did an interview with an individual that talked about that, the seeker-sensitive churches. It's only 10% of those. 88% are actually not looking. And so I think the great challenge for those of you that are pastors and teachers and parents and everybody else is that you're going to have to show that there's a connection between their needs because this is a generation that's feeling high levels of anxiety, maybe even depression, maybe a higher iteration of suicide tendencies and things of that nature. You're really going to need to show them that those problems or issues they're dealing with do find their answer in the Bible, do find their answers in the person of Jesus Christ, can actually see a difference if they attend church. And so that is the case. And yet, at the same time, a lot of the individuals who are spiritual, not religious, basically have, if you might call it, bad theology. Now, we talk about that in our biblical point of view on the next generation, but in this one, I go into a book which we did interviews on really decades ago, if you can believe that, soul-searching religious and spiritual lives of American teenagers, in which the individuals, Christian Smith and his co-author, identified what they called therapeutic moralistic deism, or moralistic therapeutic deism. And that is the idea that God exists, people should be good, God's going to grade on the curve, we're all going to go to heaven, and all the rest. And it was a concern back then, but recognize those teenagers that Christian Smith at Notre Dame and others were interviewing are now individuals that are raising their own kids, or maybe not married, but they're much older now, and as a result, that is the case. And when they then ask them to maybe define why they believe that, the most often answer was, whatever. They really hadn't thought it through, which again is one of the reasons why we like to teach this whole idea of apologetics. As a matter of fact, next hour we're going to get into later this hour, I should say, we're going to get into this whole issue of how to think from a biblical point of view. But how do we respond? Well, first of all, we recognize that these are individuals that have really adopted a false spirituality. And if you think about it, the scriptures talk about that in 2 Timothy 3. Paul, in perhaps his last letter, certainly his last letter to Timothy, writes about those who have the appearance of godliness but deny its power. And it seems to me that one of the things we need to do as we engage somebody there is to help them understand that they may have an inadequate or a completely unbiblical view about God. Lots of times people say, well, I don't believe in God because I don't believe in the God of the Bible. Well, I don't believe in the view that you have of God either because you don't have a biblical view of God. They also have an unbiblical view of human nature. If you think all people are basically good, well, then why do you need a Savior? It makes good sense. If you think everybody's good, everybody's going to heaven, then you don't certainly need to talk about your sin nature. And so then I would say that Romans 3:23, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and things of that nature are going to be really important. And so I take you through some of the theological issues, and then I really give you some action steps. What could pastors teach on? What could Sunday school teachers teach on? How could we maybe reach out to this next generation? Because in some respects, what we're talking about is a whole generation now in positions of authority who say, well, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. And again, be glad to make it available to you. Of course, it's one of the benefits of becoming a member of the Truth Team for $1 a day, $30 a month or more. You'll receive these automatically, but we'd be glad to send them to you as well. And most importantly, let me encourage you to go to the website right now and sign up for the Viewpoints commentary. We'll come back and talk about happiness right after this.
Let's be honest. Getting a well-rounded and biblical understanding of current events takes time that many of us simply don't have. Well, here's the good news. You can get thoroughly researched biblical insight on a variety of topics in 2 minutes or less each day by subscribing to Kerby Anderson's Viewpoints commentary. These short, free emails offer Kerby's personal perspective on issues affecting us in America, and they are filled with educational resources. Listen to this testimonial from David, a longtime Viewpoint subscriber.
I've been reading Kerby's daily commentaries every weekday for years now. Never miss one because they're always incredibly well written and researched, to the point, and really are meaningful. I would recommend the commentaries to anybody.
Subscribe to Viewpoints for free by going to pointofview.net/signup. That's pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
As I mentioned, we're going to be talking about this issue of happiness. I think you really will appreciate that. And it comes from our friends at the Worldview Bulletin, which, again, I encourage you so often to subscribe to. I'm not asking you to do something I haven't done, and I do appreciate all the different articles that appear there. Now, one of the individuals that we like to interview from time to time is Christopher Reese, who is a blogger, really kind of an expert in Christian worldview issues and apologetics, author of, for example, 100 Old Testament quotes by Jesus, how Christ used the Hebrew Scriptures. Also, of course, as we've mentioned before, the founder and editor-in-chief of the Worldview Bulletin, and an individual that we like to call on from time to time. So, Christopher, thank you for joining us once again here on Point of View.
It's great to be with you, Kerby. Appreciate those kind words about the Worldview Bulletin.
I might just mention, too, that we will give you, at best, an overview in this last half hour here before the program ends. It, as I told my producer, Steve, it printed out as 9 pages. Now, to be fair, 3 of those pages are endnotes, but still, there's a lot to cover, so let's get into it. And that is, you certainly say that all normal human beings want to be happy. Aristotle observed that happiness is a goal of human life. We have life, liberty, and what? The pursuit of happiness. And so in some respects, there is a real desire for Americans and for people in general to want to be happy. But happiness seems to be elusive for a lot of individuals. And I'd love to know, if nothing else, why you felt that this was something you need to write about.
Right, yeah. I guess this is just such a kind of a fundamental issue, that pretty much everyone can relate to. And it's something that I think we all think about and wonder about. And also there are, always these competing ideas in the culture around us about how we can be happy and achieve that. And a lot of times those are in conflict with Scripture. And so it just, felt like a timely topic to talk about.
Well, and again, we've also talked about how there are some of these lies, and by the time I get to about your third paragraph, you're talking about one from a Disney soundtrack, you must be true to your heart. That's when the heavens will part. And then others, when you follow your heart, if you have to journey far, here's a little trick. You don't need a guiding star. Trust your ticker, and you'll get there quicker. So part of the problem is that people have bought a false box top, a false worldview that says if you want to be happy, then you just need to follow your heart. You need to do what you want to do. And yet we see a whole generation now doing that, and they seem to be less happy than the previous generation, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's amazing how widespread this idea is in culture about, the way to happiness is just sort of looking within yourself. And, if you just sort of stare in the mirror long enough, you'll be able to find these answers to, meaning and purpose in life. And, ultimately it will lead to disappointment if you do that.
I think some people that would like to get into this a little bit more, you give us some really great quotes. Dallas Willard, and we have Martin Luther. We have Frederick Buechner, just all sorts of individuals, Thomas Tarrant, Timothy Keller. So there are certainly a number of individuals that have looked at these issues of desires and goals. But one of the things that I think we can discern even from the Scripture is to go back to the Hebrew word shalom. And early on, you talk about that because whether you look at the Hebrew word or the New Testament counterpart, it does seem to me that that's part of it. And in some respects, that's maybe the missing piece in this modern, fast-paced, frenetic North American lifestyle. What are your thoughts?
That's true. Yeah, when Scripture talks about happiness, it doesn't use that word, but when it talks about that concept, it tends to use the word shalom.
Right.
And that word is often translated peace. But it has the idea of fullness and well-being, contentment and completeness. And so it's not just kind of an emotional state of mind or a kind of subjective feeling, a good feeling, but it's this idea of kind of a holistic health and well-being in all areas of your life.
One of the things that you also bring out, and you give some very good quotes, so I may even use those, is our relationship with God, because just before you came, I talked about the latest booklet, the one I put out on a biblical view on false spirituality, because we run into so many people that say, well, I'm spiritual but not religious, which is another way of saying, look, I'm going to kind of be in a spiritual sense, but I don't need God, I don't need the Bible, I don't need church. And you give us some quotes from Dallas Willard talking about the fact that we're God's co-laborers, so we should recognize that if that's the case, we should be related to God and we should see God's plan for our life. Or you also have a quote from Timothy Keller. Love this one. We labor under the illusion that we are competent to run our own lives, achieve our own sense of self-worth, and find a purpose big enough to give us meaning in life without God. In some respects, I thought that my commentary, this last segment before we had you on, and my booklet on false spirituality kind of underscores that, because if you really want to be happy, you may be trying to fill this God-shaped vacuum with material goods, power, sexuality, whatever it might be. And even though you might say, I'm good, in the deepest part of your heart, you know that you're very unhappy because you just wander the planet looking for more, and you can't seem to find it because you resist the opportunity to look to God to find it.
That's right. Another one of the folks that I quote in the piece is Blaise Pascal, who was a scientist and a great Christian thinker. And he mentions there that we as human beings have this infinite void in our souls, and the only thing that can fill this infinite void is an infinite being like God. And everything else will fall short. All the material things or the experiences or anything else can never fill that chasm, in our soul that can only be filled by God. And so, it's no wonder that a lot of people end up, very disappointed when they pursue all these different things, and it just ends up in frustration for them.
Again, we try to fill it, as it says, from all these surroundings, but these, again quoting from Blaise Pascal, are all inadequate, because the infinite abyss can only be filled by the infinite and immutable object, that is to say, only by God himself. And for just a minute, let me digress from your article for a second. You speak on the issue of apologetics, but one of the apologetic arguments that C.S. Lewis oftentimes used is that if you find yourself looking around the world and find that nothing in the world satisfies, but you constantly long for it, it would suggest that you were made for something other than planet Earth. You were made for something more than just a physical reality here. And it seems to me that that can be a very powerful argument. Might not be one that I use for somebody in a third world country who's just trying to figure out whether or not to get the next meal, but you run into a lot of people here in North America that are fairly wealthy, and they've tried everything and nothing works. And in some respects, that's a good apologetic argument, I think, for the existence of God and for the fact that you have a soul, don't you think?
That's right. That's something that I believe Os Guinness calls a signal of transcendence. It's something that we observe about our experience that is really a pointer to God and his existence. And we realize we have this sort of void that in our lives, and we're looking for meaning and purpose, value, and that's really ultimately found in God. But that desire is definitely, that's what C.S. Lewis talked about, and some people today call the argument from desire that you mentioned. And
right.
So it's definitely a pointer to something that is out there that we need.
Christopher Reese with us. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue talking about what does it mean to be happy. We've talked about your relationship with God. In a minute, we're going to talk about a few other things, your relationship with ourselves and relationship with others. But as we go to a break, let me just mention that we have posted this article from the Worldview Bulletin newsletter. There's a way in which you could print that out. So again, you don't have to subscribe, but there is a button to subscribe, and I would encourage you to do so. But if you find yourself saying, well, I'd kind of like to read this in its entirety, we've made it available for you on the website, but I hope you also might click on that button that says subscribe. I think you'd really benefit from all the articles they post. We'll be back right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking for a few more minutes with Christopher Reese. Again, this particular article, What Does It Mean to Be Happy? We have posted it, so you don't have to subscribe, and you can just download it. And it comes from the Worldview Bulletin newsletter. It might just mention that you can get a monthly amount or a yearly amount. I'll let you figure that out. I've just routinely had it charge my credit card, and makes real simple, easy one for me. But I'll let you figure out what you want to do, if you want to do it at all. But I think these kinds of issues related to worldview and apologetics so important. And when I first heard Paul Copan and Paul Gould and others talking about that, and then got to meet Christopher Reese, just wanted to let you know from time to time that we find so many good articles there. We also have identified some great guests on this program who I was unaware of until they had written an article in this particular newsletter. So great resources, but let's get to a couple of more real quickly, and that is we talked about your relationship with God, but I thought another good piece that you had in there, Christopher, was your relationship with ourselves. Okay, we come to the fall, and because of that, our hearts were darkened, it says in Romans 1. We become idolaters. We're filled with all sorts of issues. And as one individual you quote, Cornelius Platinga says, God hates sin, not just because it violates his law, but most substantially because it violates shalom, which we talked about. It breaks the peace because it interferes with the ways things are supposed to be. And that is when we become Christians, God regenerates us, and this new self can be renewed, and we should be renewing our minds daily. And certainly that is the key that we talk about, and you can see that in 2 Corinthians, you can see that in Romans 12 and other passages. But it does seem to me that another very important foundational issue in happiness is having a right relationship with God and also understanding who you are in relationship to God, don't you think?
That's exactly right. Both of these are important aspects of shalom. And another way to think of shalom is flourishing. And in order to flourish, we have to have a right relationship with God, which we were just talking about, also a right relationship with ourselves. And we lost that in the fall. Martin Luther talks about our human natures being curved in on each other after the fall,
right?
As a result of that. And so, and because of that, we have to be born again. And when we are, this starts a process of sanctification where God is healing aspects of our individual souls that need to be healed and repaired and made in his image. And as that process continues, we experience more shalom in our personal lives.
The other issue I wanted to put on the table, relationship with God, relationship with ourselves, now relationship with others. Because once you have the fall, once you're dealing with fallen, sinful individuals, broken individuals in a broken culture, we also look forward to the day in which things will be made perfect. New heavens, new earth, return of Christ, all that. But it seems to me that even though there has been, as Christ talks about, this dividing wall of hostility, it's been broken down, that Paul talks about in Ephesians 2. And in some respects, then we have a new person, a new humanity. And as a result, then some of the divisions begin to evaporate. Galatians 3:28, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, male and female. We're all one in Christ Jesus. You have a passage in Colossians that goes into that as well. And it does seem to me that, again, sometimes we can't get happiness because we can't get along with the people next to us. And yet part of that goes back to the need for us to actually live out the Christian life on a day-to-day basis.
That's right. So much goes back to Genesis 3, where the fall takes place. And we see what happens there after Adam and Eve sin. Their relationship with each other is ruptured. They're cast out of the garden, out of God's presence. That relationship is broken also, and then there's just sort of a downward spiral from there until God sends the flood. And he says he does that because human beings, the thoughts of their hearts are continually evil, and they're basically preying on each other and treating each other horribly. So much stems from that. And but again, as we've been talking about, when we come to Christ, we're new creations, and God brings us into this new family, his family, the church, and it's a whole different type of interaction there. As you mentioned, Christ creates in himself one new humanity, as it says in Ephesians, and here the relationship is based on love and forgiveness, stimulating one another to love and good deeds, Hebrews says. And so as a result of that, shalom comes into our interpersonal relationships, and we experience that peace through that.
Again, there are a lot of great points, but since we're coming to the end here, I thought I would mention one that made me laugh out loud. Maybe I've just got a funny sense of humor, but Thaddeus Williams, we had on the program, said, the more you worship yourself, the less you become yourself. You become a shadow, a specter, an unself. The longer and deeper you stare in the mirror looking for answers, the more it feels like you're looking at Edvard Munch's The Scream. This is the strange paradox of self-worship. If you've ever seen The Scream, I think anybody that's ever seen that painting, I mean, it's pretty horrible, but it's a reminder then that is kind of this self-worship issue. And I don't know, maybe I'll even do a booklet on self-worship in the future, but nevertheless, you can find all of that in this particular article. What does it mean to be happy? I might just mention that again, if you say, well, what are some of the other issues that you've been talking about at the Worldview newsletter? Well, we have, for example, what I learned from 100 atheists who converted to Christianity. Melissa Cain Travis, haven't had her on to talk about this. We kind of avoided that, but the mystery man of the shroud, she goes into that. John West, we had just on recently, that's a summary of his book that we talked about, The Stockholm Syndrome Christianity. And of course, we've had our good friend Doug Groteis on what is the future of apologetics. So those are just a few of the many good articles, some of which we've talked about on the program, others that we've referred to. And so if you'd like to know a little bit more, of course, we have this article. We have a link to, of course, the information that is available there from the particular Worldview Bulletin. And so all of that is available on our website at pointofview.net. Christopher, as always, thank you for editing it. Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks so much for having me. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
We are just about out of time, so let me just mention a couple of quick things. If you find yourself saying, okay, I want to find Gary Bauer's end-of-day report, that's our first article. We have a couple of others in terms of economic growth. We've talked about the so-called transphobic HHS report, as well as what does it mean to be happy? And most importantly, I hope that you might go to the website, even if we go off the air, click on that button that says subscribe today to the Viewpoints commentary. That's one of the things we've been talking about this week, and that's one of the reasons we had our good friend Gary Bauer on. But all of the material that we've talked about today available on the website at pointofview.net. Also want to thank Megan for her help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program, and thank you for listening, because we cover so many issues, and we're going to cover a whole lot more the rest of this week. So stay tuned, and we'll see you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up, but we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.